They laughed at her for being a maid, until she was revealed as the building's true owner. The first time it happened that week, nobody said a word. She stepped into the lobby just before lunch, carrying a plastic bag with a neatly folded uniform inside. Her shoes, though polished, were a bit worn. Her hands, though clean, showed signs of work that required more elbow grease than elegance. And when she reached the front desk to sign in, 3 young men in tailored suits, tenants, obviously, laughed a little too loudly. She lost again, one of them said under his breath, tossing his keys in the air like a juggler of entitlement. Bet she still thinks the tips are worth it. The second time it happened, it was worse. She walked into the diner on West 54th, just 3 blocks from the luxury building where she scrubbed countertops and emptied trash cans without complaint. She had put on her nicest white dress that day, something simple, a little old-fashioned. It was her only white dress, one she had saved for occasions when life might surprise her with something good. It did not. The hostess glanced at her, then at the gold-rimmed menus, then back at her again. "We're full," she said flatly, despite the 3 empty booths behind her. The woman smiled softly. "I'm just here for the interview," she said. "For the part-time evening shift." The hostess blinked. "Oh, that." She turned to fetch the manager. Moments later, as the woman adjusted her dress nervously and clutched her resume with both hands, a teenage waiter carrying a tray of drinks brushed past her with clumsy force. A full cup of Coca-Cola spilled down the front of her white dress, leaving a trail of dark, sticky shame in its wake. Nobody apologized. Not the boy, not the hostess, and certainly not the manager who arrived just in time to see the aftermath and muttered, "Maybe it's not the right fit," before walking away. The woman bent down in silence, picking up her resume now stained and soaked. One edge tore. She didn't try to fix it. That moment is when the camera should have frozen. Because that woman, bent over in a pool of soda, invisible to everyone around her, was not just a maid. And this was not her first time being underestimated. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where stories like these unfold quietly until they roar. If this is your first time here, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. These stories take time, care, and heart to bring to life, and your support helps us shine a light on the truths that often go unseen. She was called Miss Vera by some, Aunt V by the few kids who knew her kindness. But her full name was Vera Lynn Elkins, and though no one bothered to ask, that name once echoed through hospital halls and government offices with respect. Before she ever picked up a mop or cleaned a toilet in silence, Vera Lynn had spent 20 years as an administrative coordinator at St. Clair's Medical. She had trained nurses, scheduled entire wings of the hospital, and balanced budgets with a precision that CFOs envied. Her desk had once been next to the window, overlooking the park. Then came the accident. Her husband, Raymond, steel-toed boots, 6'2", the kind of man who left little love notes on sticky pads, was killed in a scaffolding collapse at a downtown construction site. One minute he was laying bricks, the next, the wind took him. The insurance covered nothing. The company claimed he was off duty. Vera Lynn never fought it in court. She couldn't afford the lawyer. Instead, she folded into herself. She sold their house, moved into a cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, and poured herself into raising 2 children, both girls, both bright as spring sunshine. She took night shifts, learned to stretch meals into weeks, smiled through job interviews where no one looked her in the eye. She aged quietly. Gray strands snuck through her hair. Arthritis began to settle into her fingers. But she never stopped walking forward, until the city swallowed her whole and deposited her into the role nobody wanted. The quiet, elderly black woman who pushed cleaning carts in luxury buildings where the doormen called her sweetheart, but never meant it. On Mondays, she polished brass elevators while residents stepped around her, still on their Bluetooth calls. On Tuesdays, she scrubbed floors beneath paintings worth more than her annual wage. On Wednesdays, she cleaned the penthouse guest suite without ever once being allowed to enter through the front door. She never complained. Not once. And yet, they still treated her like wallpaper. Forgettable. Replaceable. It was during one of those Wednesdays, right before the 4th of July, that a young woman, blonde, angry at nothing in particular, left a bag of fast food on the marble bench in the lobby and walked away. Vera Lynn waited. Maybe she'd forgotten it. 10 minutes passed. She checked again. It was greasy and beginning to smell. Verilyn threw it out. 3 hours later, the girl stormed down to the front desk, furious that her lunch had vanished. When the security guard calmly explained that no food could be left in shared spaces, she demanded to see camera footage. The footage was shown. There Verilyn was, on screen, glancing around nervously before picking up the bag and walking toward the service hallway. She stole it, the girl cried. Can you believe that? She's probably starving. How pathetic. Verilyn wasn't called in to explain. No one asked her version of the story. The building manager merely left a yellow slip in her locker the next morning. Please be more mindful of tenant property. She read it, folded it once, slipped it into her coat pocket, and then went back to work. That evening, as she emptied trash bins on the 4th floor, a young man stepped into the hallway and nearly walked into her. He looked up, startled. Oh, it's just you. Then, just before his door shut behind him, he muttered, "This building really needs better help." She paused, just for a second, then kept walking. What no one knew, what no one even bothered to wonder, was that Verilyn had been receiving letters, handwritten, from someone who addressed her as Ms. Elkins and ended each page with, "We're watching. We remember. And we thank you." They arrived every month. No return address, just a pressed gold seal on the back. She didn't know who sent them. She never told anyone. But she kept them all. Somewhere, tucked between an old Bible and a faded photo album, those letters formed a quiet choir of voices that whispered, "You still matter." That week, as she sat alone in the back of the laundry room during her break, her lunch was a peanut butter sandwich, cut into perfect halves. A shadow passed across the frosted window. She looked up. A man stood on the other side, backlit by fluorescent hallway light. He didn't knock, didn't speak, just watched her for a second. Then he left. She blinked. Had she imagined it? No. She knew that walk. She'd seen it once before, decades ago. The next day, the building posted a notice. All residents are invited to the annual ownership assembly. Lobby conference room. Mandatory for board members. Optional for all others. Verilyn glanced at it once. Then again. Then she walked away, a quiet breath catching at the back of her throat. Because that was the first time they used the word ownership, and she had a very specific reason to pay attention. And though no one knew it yet, Verilyn Elkins had a key in her pocket that didn't belong to a broom closet or maintenance room. It belonged to something else entirely. A room where power wore expensive suits, and she, a housekeeper, had long been the silent majority they never saw coming. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. A maid who stayed too long on the elevator. A cleaner who wandered too close to the private gym. A woman with no husband, no jewelry, no visible life outside of bleach-scented corridors and utility closets. What was she still doing here? Some called her pitiful. Others simply didn't call her anything at all. Verilyn Elkins had become part of the building's architecture, as unnoticed as the light bulbs above the concierge desk. But life hadn't forgotten her. It was just watching. That Friday, the sky turned overcast. She stepped out in the morning mist, her coat buttoned high, her footsteps measured. The manager barely glanced at her as she clocked in. She nodded anyway. The tenants were in a rush, as always, half-eaten croissants in hand, barking at invisible assistants through earbuds. On the 22nd floor, someone had vomited in the hallway. No one apologized. She cleaned it in silence. In the stairwell, a delivery man shoved past her, barely muttering a word. On the 5th floor, a child laughed at the way her hands shook while picking up a crushed juice box. The mother said nothing, just took the child's hand and walked away. When she applied for a housekeeping job at the nearby hotel, the front desk clerk took one look and asked if she was lost. Verilyn turned back, walked 3 blocks in the opposite direction, and spent her lunch break on a bench, feeding pigeons with breadcrumbs from her coat pocket. She didn't cry. That was the thing about her. There were no outbursts, no begging, no firework speeches, just an infinite well of grace. But inside, it was getting harder. Each rejection chipped away at something essential. She thought of her daughters. The younger one hadn't called in 2 months. The older one sent birthday cards, but never signed them with love. She thought of the Christmas when all 3 of them had shared one pie and made it last 2 days. She thought of Raymond, her husband, and how his voice used to fill a room like light. It had been years, but some mornings she still reached for him before remembering he was gone. That afternoon, as she scrubbed the floor near the service elevator, A security guard approached. Young, nervous, didn't meet her eyes. He handed her a folded sheet of paper. Building policy update, he mumbled. She unfolded it slowly. It wasn't policy. It was a warning. Tenants had filed complaints. Someone said she had lingered too long on their floor. Another claimed she had used the laundry machines after hours. Effective immediately, her hours were to be reduced. Her benefits under review. Please speak to management by Monday. She nodded. Didn't argue. Just slid the paper into her apron and continued scrubbing the floor. That night, the rain came hard. Her walk home took twice as long. The wind bit through her coat like it had a grudge. When she reached her apartment, the lights flickered once, then died. She lit a candle, opened a can of soup, ate it cold. The room smelled of mildew. Her hands ached from the cold, from the work, from the years. And still, she didn't cry. She pulled out the stack of letters again. Read the oldest one. Ms. Elkins, you do not go unseen. You are valued. You are not forgotten. She folded it carefully, blew out the candle. The next morning, a neighbor passed her in the hallway. A young woman, 20 maybe, who had once asked Vera Lynn to watch her cat. Today, she avoided eye contact. Didn't speak. Just pulled her coat tighter and walked faster. Vera Lynn looked after her, then glanced down. Something shimmered near the doormat. A bracelet. Silver. She picked it up, turned it over, walked down the hall, and slid it under the neighbor's door. She didn't knock. Later that day, a boy in a hoodie dropped his phone near the front steps. He looked up, startled, when Vera Lynn returned it. Thanks, he muttered, then hesitated. You work here? She smiled. Something like that. That evening, as she emptied trash in the staff lounge, a custodian from another building walked in. Middle-aged, kind face. They had exchanged nods in the past, but never words. Today he said one. Tired? She paused. A little. He nodded. Me too. That was it. 2 words. But it was the kindest thing she'd heard in weeks. In the background, the security cameras hummed. No one noticed the lens quietly following her down the hallway. No one saw the man in the monitoring room lean forward, rewind the footage, watch her return the bracelet, then hit save. For the 5th time in 3 weeks, he saved footage of Vera Lynn Elkins doing something good when no one was watching. Outside, the city moved like it always had. Fast, unforgiving, blind. But something was shifting. Quietly. Invisibly. She couldn't see it yet. But someone was watching. And that someone had power. On Sunday morning, she walked to the community center. It was closed. A printed sign flapped on the door, funding suspended. She sighed. Turned away. As she crossed the street, a boy on a bike nearly hit her. She stumbled back. He didn't stop. Didn't even look. The bag of fruit she carried spilled. Apples rolled into the gutter. She knelt slowly, picked them up one by one. A woman walking past didn't stop to help, but took out her phone. A few hours later, Vera Lynn's photo appeared on social media. The caption read, "Still working at her age? Get it, Grandma." Hundreds of laughing emojis followed. She didn't see it. Didn't know, but others did. Including someone sitting in a high-rise boardroom, watching the trend. Someone who didn't laugh. Someone who made a call. The building's ownership meeting was set for Thursday. Notices went out. Tenants skimmed them, deleted them, ignored them. Vera Lynn received hers folded in half and left in the break room. She stared at it for a long time. And then something inside her shifted. Just slightly. A whisper. A memory. An instinct. She folded it carefully, placed it in her bag, and said nothing. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the rain. The city was quiet. A kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. Like something waiting. And somewhere across town, a light turned on in a room filled with paper and signatures and names. One of those names was Vera Lynn Elkins. And beside it, in bold black ink, were the words, Majority Stakeholder. She didn't know it yet, but the world was about to remember her name. By the time Thursday arrived, the building was humming with its usual pace. Espresso cups clinking, heels tapping against polished floors, voices floating through Bluetooth headsets. But underneath it all was a subtle ripple, something unseen that moved just beneath the surface, as if the building itself sensed that something was about to shift. Vera Lynn arrived early that day. Too early. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the same brown leather bag she had carried for over a decade. Inside was a modest lunch, a single letter folded 3 times, and a memory she couldn't shake. She took her time climbing the stairs instead of the elevator, step by aching step, as if ascending through years of silence and labor. The notice had said the meeting would take place in the ground floor conference room. She knew the room. She had cleaned it many times. She had once polished the glass water pitchers without ever daring to pour herself a sip. Now, she stood just outside its doors, listening. On the other side, laughter and small talk filled the space. She wasn't expected. Not really. Not by the tenants who saw her as part of the background, nor by the management team who sent out their emails with clipped civility but couldn't remember her last name. A man in a navy suit passed by without a second glance. He opened the door for himself, not for her. She followed him in slowly. Nobody looked up. No one paused. In the far corner, a projector flickered to life as the building manager cleared his throat. "Good afternoon, everyone. Let's begin." Vera Lynn found a seat in the back. No one noticed. No one asked why she was there. The presentation was routine at first. Numbers, maintenance updates, security budget allocations. But then came the part that always made the room lean forward: ownership shifts. As some of you know, the manager said, "We've had an internal restructuring of investor shares this quarter. Some previous owners have liquidated, and a new primary stakeholder has emerged." Murmurs spread across the room. "Wait, what?" someone whispered. "Who?" The manager cleared his throat again, uncomfortable now. "You've probably seen her before," he said slowly. "You pass her every day. You may have ignored her. You may have said things you don't even remember. But she owns this building. Most of it, in fact." The room fell silent. Eyes turned. And then, at last, they saw her. Vera Lynn Elkins sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap, her posture regal in a way that didn't need height or luxury to command the air. "Miss Elkins," the manager said, motioning toward her, "has acquired a majority ownership stake in this property through a trust established years ago. As of last month, she is now the largest investor in the Eastbrook Towers." Silence stretched across the room like a held breath. A woman near the front, the same one who had once snapped her fingers for Vera Lynn to clean a spill, lowered her gaze to the table. A man who had once joked about old maids in the elevator cleared his throat and reached for his water glass. One by one, they looked at her. Not past her. Not through her. At her. Vera Lynn didn't smile. Not yet. She simply nodded, once, slowly, and stood. Her voice was soft when it came, but it carried. "I don't need to say much. The numbers speak louder than I ever could. But I will say this. I have been here a long time. I've seen every floor. I've cleaned every corner. I know the smell of this place before it wakes and after it sleeps. And I've watched how we treat people we think are beneath us. I watched it for years." Her hands didn't shake now. They were steady, calm. "Respect," she said simply, "is not about what you wear or what you earn. It's about what you carry. And some of us carry a lot more than others ever see." Then she sat down. That was all. No grand declarations. No revenge speech. Just the truth, dropped gently into a room that suddenly couldn't meet her eyes. The meeting continued, but nothing felt the same. The air had changed. The people had changed. Or maybe just their eyes. When it was over, no one blocked her path as she walked to the front of the room and signed the final ownership confirmation document. Her name, once scribbled on time cards and locker labels, now shimmered in bold print beside the word owner. She stepped outside into the cold afternoon light, and for the first time in a very long time, she let herself breathe deep. She wasn't sure what would come next. She didn't need to be, because in that moment, standing in front of the same building that had treated her like a ghost for so many years, she had done something no one could take away. She had changed the story. And the story was only just beginning. The news traveled faster than anyone could contain it. By the following morning, tenants who had once refused to acknowledge Vera Lynn began whispering in the elevators, their faces pale with the weight of hindsight. Some tried to pretend they'd known all along, offering fake smiles and tight-lipped greetings that sounded like apologies without actually being apologies. Others avoided her altogether, ducking into corridors or turning their backs when she passed. But Vera Lynn noticed none of it. Or rather, she noticed everything and chose to let it drift by like autumn leaves on wind. She had no interest in revenge. She did not wake up that morning craving acknowledgement. She brewed her tea the same way, packed her lunch the same way, tied her hair into the same low bun that had held through years of labor. But her steps had changed. They were lighter, Not proud, not boastful, just quiet and sure. That day, she returned to the building not with a mop, but with a manila folder. Inside were proposals for maintenance improvements, community events, and resident feedback reforms, things she had dreamed of suggesting when no one would have listened. Now they would. She met briefly with the building's board, not as an employee, but as an owner. The manager who once avoided eye contact now nodded eagerly, laughed too loudly, took notes that no one asked him to take. Verilyn said little. She let the document speak for her. As she stood at the head of the table in a modest gray cardigan, hands gently clasped, one of the junior executives who had mocked her just weeks earlier raised his hand and asked, with a nervous tremble, what inspired her to invest in the building. She looked at him for a long second before answering. Because I knew it could be better, she said. And because I believe people can change. That afternoon, a formal notice was circulated across the tenant email list. Changes in building leadership, updates on code of conduct, an acknowledgement that the new majority stakeholder was committed to dignity and equity in all operations. The same tenants who had laughed at her in the laundry room now read those lines twice. Some forwarded them to each other in disbelief. Others scrolled down in shame. That evening, Verilyn didn't take the service elevator. She stepped into the main glass lift, nodded politely to the couple already inside, and pressed the button for the 24th floor. They said nothing. One stared at his shoes. The other gave her a look that wasn't quite fear, wasn't quite admiration. Somewhere in between. When the elevator doors opened, a boy of about 9 stood waiting. He blinked up at her, then at the clipboard in her hand. Are you the boss now? He asked. Verilyn smiled. Something like that. He grinned and ran off. That night, as she left the building, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and a woman stepped out, the same restaurant manager who had dismissed her during the Coca-Cola incident. She held an envelope in both hands and walked toward Verilyn stiffly, unsure whether to approach. Verilyn stood still. Miss Elkins, the woman began, her voice brittle. I didn't know. I'm sorry. I was wrong. About a lot of things. She held out the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, an apology, and a gift card to the same restaurant. Verilyn glanced at it. Thank you, she said. Not cruel, not cold, just calm. Then she turned away, leaving the woman standing on the sidewalk with more guilt than any note could undo. Across town, someone was watching. A young man in a quiet office played back footage from the security system. Verilyn returning the lost bracelet, helping a neighbor carry groceries, sitting beside an elderly resident during a power outage, offering her last sandwich to a homeless man on the block. All of it documented. None of it staged. He clicked a button and archived the footage into a file labeled Humanity. Then he picked up the phone and dialed. She's ready, he said. On Friday, the city newspaper published a quiet story, from housekeeper to owner, how one woman changed the culture of a building without saying a word. Verilyn's name was printed in black ink for the first time in decades. But she didn't frame the article. She folded it in half, placed it inside a photo album beside her daughter's childhood pictures, and moved on. That afternoon, she stood quietly at the front of a staff meeting. The janitorial crew sat in silence, unsure why they were there. She introduced herself, then opened the folder and handed out new wage policies, upgraded benefits, and the promise of dignity in every shift. One of the women began to cry. Another stood and clapped. Verilyn simply nodded. She didn't need thanks. She just needed to make it better. And she did. Outside the conference room, a few tenants stood watching through the glass, unsure what to say. One of them, the same young man who had once dismissed her as background noise, stepped forward and opened the door. Miss Elkins, he said softly. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. And thank you. She looked at him and offered a smile that was neither approval nor forgiveness. It was peace. That was all. Peace. As the day ended, she walked through the lobby, no longer invisible, no longer uncertain. Her heels echoed softly against the marble as heads turned and backs straightened. But she didn't walk for them. She walked for herself. For every morning, she had risen with nothing and still given everything. For every insult she had swallowed and turned into strength. And as the glass doors opened and she stepped into the late afternoon sun, a little boy waved from a passing car window and called out, That's her. That's the nice lady who helped my grandma. She raised a hand in return, and for the first time in years, She felt the world seeing her not as what she was expected to be, but as who she truly was. A month later, the building no longer felt like the same place. The cold distance that once filled its polished halls had softened. Smiles were no longer rare. People held the elevator doors open for one another. The concierge asked how your day was and actually waited for an answer. At the center of it all, Vera Lynn moved quietly, without fanfare, like a candle lighting other candles without losing her own flame. She now lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment on the 12th floor, the one facing east where the sun came in like honey across the windows each morning. It had been a gift from the board, a gesture of gratitude, though she had insisted on paying something, even if it was only a symbolic dollar. Her old neighborhood, the cramped apartment with its peeling paint and humming pipes, was far behind her now, but she didn't forget it. She kept a photo of her old building on her nightstand, a reminder not of struggle, but of the strength it had forged in her. Each morning, she made oatmeal and drank tea by the window while listening to classical music on the old radio Raymond had left behind. Some days she volunteered at the women's shelter 3 blocks over, folding blankets, sorting clothes, sharing stories without judgment. The women there didn't know she owned a luxury building. She never told them. They just knew her as Miss Vera, the kind lady who always remembered to bring extra pairs of socks. In the evenings, she helped a single mother 2 floors down by tutoring her son in math. The boy had struggled in school for months, but now looked forward to their sessions, not because of the numbers, but because Miss Vera made him feel like he could do something right. One Saturday morning, the restaurant manager who had once poured soda down her dress came to the building under the guise of a routine health inspection. Vera Lynn was in the garden courtyard, tending to the new flower beds she had commissioned to replace the old concrete benches. The woman approached slowly, carrying a small box. "I didn't know what to bring," she said, her voice low. "I just wanted to try again." Inside the box was a white lily bulb and a note. It read, "I was blind. Thank you for teaching me to see." Vera Lynn accepted it without a word and planted it in the soil with her own hands. 2 weeks later, it bloomed. Tenants who had once ignored her now brought her homemade cookies, holiday cards, and soft-spoken thank yous in the lobby. One even asked if she'd consider mentoring his daughter, who was studying real estate law. Vera Lynn declined with a gentle smile. "Let her make her own name first," she said. She was not interested in titles or legacy. She only wanted to know that the space she left behind would be kinder than the one she walked into all those years ago. She still walked the halls, not out of necessity, but because she liked to hear the rhythm of the building, to sense the changes in its pulse. She nodded at every doorman and janitor, remembered birthdays, left small notes of encouragement taped to lockers and lunchboxes. The staff no longer saw her as a ghost from a forgotten past. They saw her as what she had always quietly been, a pillar holding up everything that mattered. One rainy afternoon, a tenant's teenage daughter approached her in the lobby. She was nervous, fidgeting with the sleeves of her hoodie. "My mom said you used to work here," she said, hesitant. "Like clean. Is that true?" Vera Lynn nodded. "Yes, I did." The girl paused. "And now you own it." Another nod. "Yes." The girl blinked. "How did you do that?" Vera Lynn's answer was simple. "I never stopped believing that I was more than what people saw." The girl didn't say anything else, just smiled and walked away a little taller. The next day, someone had chalked those same words onto the sidewalk outside the building in neat, careful handwriting. "I am more than what you see." A few days later, a framed photo appeared in the staff break room. It showed Vera Lynn, years ago, mop in hand, smiling faintly at the camera, unaware she was being photographed. Below it, a small plaque read, "The woman who reminded us all how to see." She never mentioned it, just nodded quietly when she noticed it, and continued sipping her tea. On Sundays, she liked to visit the park where Raymond used to read to their girls. She'd sit on their old bench and feed the birds, listening to the soft chatter of families passing by. Occasionally, someone would stop and ask her for directions or compliment the flowers on her blouse. No one asked what she did. No one recognized her. And that, in its own quiet way, was a kind of peace. A woman who had been invisible for so long had no need to shine now. She had become something rarer. She had become steady. And in a world that changed too fast and too loud, that was more powerful than anyone could measure. 1 year later, on a mild spring afternoon, Vera Lynn sat on a wooden bench outside the building she once cleaned from top to bottom, the same building she now quietly owned. Children played on the newly built garden terrace where old rusted railings had once lined the perimeter. A young mother passed by, holding the hand of her daughter, and offered Vera Lynn a respectful nod, the kind given not out of obligation but recognition. Vera Lynn smiled gently, her fingers wrapped around a paper cup of tea that had long since cooled. She watched the sunlight dance off the windows above, the same windows she used to polish at dawn before the city woke. Now she had no schedule to follow, no mop bucket to push, no name tag clipped to her shirt. But she remained, not because she had nowhere else to be, but because this place had become something more than a building. It had become a reflection, a reminder, a quiet testament that sometimes the smallest, softest acts leave the deepest marks. Across the courtyard, two maintenance workers were repairing a bench. One of them, a young man with music humming from his phone, paused and looked toward Vera Lynn. "She used to run this whole place," he whispered to his coworker. The other looked over, confused. "She's the owner now, right?" The first one nodded. "Yeah, but before that, she was the one who swept this very walkway every Thursday." The second man nodded with new respect. "That's real," he said. Vera Lynn didn't hear them. Or maybe she did, and simply chose not to react. She had learned the difference between acknowledgement and performance. Her peace wasn't built on others' praise. It was built on presence. That evening, she opened a letter that had been waiting in her mailbox. It was from her younger daughter. Not an apology, not a confession, just a simple message. "Mom, I think I understand now. I'm sorry I didn't before. Can we talk?" Vera Lynn held the letter close for a long moment. Then she picked up the phone and dialed the number. The voice that answered was hesitant but warm. They spoke for over an hour. No blame, no tears, just reconnection. Later that night, she walked the hallways of the 12th floor one last time before bed. She passed the photo still hanging in the break room, the one of her in her old uniform. She paused in front of it, stared for a while, then reached up and gently adjusted the frame. Downstairs, the night concierge, new, polite, and eager, stood as she exited the elevator. "Miss Elkins," he said, "there's a woman waiting in the lobby for you." Vera Lynn walked over slowly. Sitting there was the same teenage girl from months ago, the one who'd asked if she had really worked here. Now older, more sure of herself, she stood when Vera Lynn approached. "I got in," she said proudly. "Real estate program. I got the scholarship. I start next fall." Vera Lynn smiled. "Congratulations." The girl hesitated, then asked, "Can I come back and talk to you sometimes? I want to learn how you did it." Vera Lynn looked at her with that same soft strength she had carried her whole life, and said, "You already are." When the girl left, Vera Lynn stepped outside. The air was cool, but not cold. The city shimmered with life, but none of it rushed her. She walked 2 blocks to the park where a new plaque had been installed beside her favorite bench. It didn't name her. It simply read, "For those who were never seen," and kept going anyway. She sat down, watched the sun lower past the skyline, and breathed in deep. Around her, the world moved on, fast and loud and forgetful. But in that little space between light and night, Vera Lynn Elkins sat as a quiet reminder that grace is the most radical form of power, and that true dignity needs no audience. Somewhere, a child laughed. Somewhere, a door opened. Somewhere, someone whispered a thank you she would never hear. And still, she smiled. Not because she won, but because she never stopped walking. And sometimes, that's enough. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone who walks quietly through life carrying more than anyone knows, then take a moment to honor them. Share this story. Leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe to Cracks of Light, where we believe the most powerful people are often the ones nobody sees, until everything changes.